And of course, wearing your mask just as a precaution, of course, as well, just to send a good message out there, because we've seen this third wave. Just tell us, how serious is it, and why has it come back, this virus, with such a vengeance?
This is actually Hong Kong's first sustained local outbreak. The March wave actually was mostly imported cases, and they really reflect the transmissibility of the virus from their place of origin, wherever they traveled back from, not really of that of Hong Kong. But this time, we're seeing predominantly local cases, and quite worryingly, a significant proportion of those whom we have very little idea where they might have got infected. Now, we also see geographic sort of concentration in the eastern side of Kowloon Peninsula, as well as on the eastern side of the New Territories, so namely Sha Tin and Kowloon East. So we are seeing quite a lot of worrying signs. We see clusters around restaurants or eateries, especially the sort of local restaurants where it's quick, it's good food, it's cheap food, and people congregate around fairly crowded or cramped conditions.
Dr. Leung, then why has it come back so forcibly, though? I mean, we haven't seen dozens, if not 40, 50 number of cases a day up until now. Do you think that the government was too early in lifting some of the early restrictions?
I think that if one does a sort of backward look now with the 2020 retrospectoscope, then you wonder whether we have maybe had some potential frailties in terms of inadequate testing of the exempted people who come into Hong Kong. And these are mostly air and sea crew, ship crew. Obviously, they need to come into Hong Kong because we need them to pilot the airplanes or the ships. But we hadn't been testing them. So I think that loophole has now been plugged. Another thing is, of course, it just shows you how difficult it is to completely eliminate this virus, even though we've had rather calm and sometimes long stretches for weeks of 0 cases in the last couple of months. And really, I think that the progressive lifting of the physical distancing measures, which were, of course, appropriate and necessary because you have to balance the economy, employment, and the social consent and the emotional well-being of people, having actually endured the very, very substantial quasi-lockdown measures in March. So I think that it's a combination of all those factors. And of course, we've been testing quite a lot, but not nearly enough, evidently. And now we are now leveraging the private sector, hoping that the private sector would give a very, very substantial boost to the testing numbers, even though we are already testing quite intensively by global standards.
Not nearly enough testing. How aggressive does Hong Kong need to be? And if Hong Kong is already doing better than most economies, is there a country and economy out there that's doing better? What should be the model?
I don't think that, as we have actually learned in the last 7 months around the world, there is no perfect model that can be completely copy and pasted to other places. I think everything has to be contextual. In the global assessment, I think Hong Kong is still, despite our recent surge in cases, is still doing very well. A lot of countries, a lot of jurisdictions would probably look at us scratching their heads, wondering why we are actually imposing these very substantial physical distancing measures again, because they would love to have our numbers. But I think that you need to understand that Hong Kong has lived through the SARS epidemic in 2003. We have had periodic threats of avian influenza spreading in humans. And so it's a very different setting than perhaps some other places.
Dr. Leung, Singapore is beginning to test sewage to better detect perhaps new clusters? It's something that's been done by the UK, by Germany, the Netherlands even. Is this something that more countries should be doing?
Well, we are also doing that in Hong Kong, and we are ramping that up quite substantially, imminently. So I think that it is something that is sensible, because what that allows you to do is, once you are back down in terms of case numbers, where the detection threshold would not be sufficiently low to pick up the occasional cases, sewage surveillance for viral particles would be a much more sensitive test. And in fact, that is what we do with other bugs around the world. So, for example, when we are talking about the eradication of polio, that's part of that surveillance regime. And that's only in the periods when we really want to know, if we don't see it in human samples, are we still getting quite a bit of it in the environment from discharge? And that's really just one other part of the full complement of surveillance.
And Dr. Leung, tell us a little bit more of how the virus has mutated since we first caught wind of it. Has it changed a lot? It seems like it's a little bit more infectious now. Is it also more deadly? So the virus, there is a key mutation. It's a substitution of that base pair from 614D to 614G, and that has actually taken place to become the now predominant strain in the last 2-3 months already. And indeed, Hong Kong is no exception to this global pattern. And our research has shown that it is probably about 30% more transmissible than the wild type or old strain. And that perhaps may be accounting for this acceleration in part, not only in Hong Kong, but also worldwide. Dr. Leung, given how difficult it is to contact trace here at the moment, you mentioned about the invisible transmission chains. Is this something, a reality we just have to live with right now, that this virus is basically going to stay until we get a vaccine?
Well, I mean, definitively, before this virus settles down, you would need to have sufficient immunity in the population. And there are only really two ways of acquiring immunity. One is through natural infection and recovery, and the other is through vaccine inoculation. So before a vaccine that is safe and effective becomes widely available to the majority of the world's population, it's not going to settle down. And so really, we're looking at months ahead where we will still have to deal with multiple waves of this worldwide.
Of course, Dr. Leung, we heard from Thailand saying that it could see a vaccine in just a matter of weeks. Is that being too optimistic?
I don't think that even if you have a safe and effective vaccine that is developed successfully, I don't think that you would see production and manufacturing capacity and distribution capacity ramped up to such an effect that you would be able to achieve widespread immunity by vaccination. And I don't think that is a matter of weeks that you would get a safe and effective vaccine proven. It will take us, I think, at least a few more months before we will have good definitive evidence, because remember, we are potentially deploying this new vaccine or several vaccines to everybody. And we must watch out for safety and very rare but potentially very serious side effects. So that is why we have to be absolutely sure, first and foremost, that we're not going to do any harm. And secondly, to make sure that the vaccine that we have will, at the very least, protect from death and serious complications requiring ICU care or ventilation.